You have no idea. No. Welcome, everybody, to another author interview. Today, I have Lord Grimdark himself, Joe Abercrombie, coming in to talk about First Law, his controversial fantasy opinions, and what it's like to be an author in the modern age of fantasy. So thank you so much for Joe coming on. I appreciate it. How are you doing?
I am doing well, and it is an absolute honor and privilege for you to have me on here.
You can't oversell me like that. That's not fair. That's not fair. But I appreciate it. And so right now, we are sitting a few months from the next First Law release. Trouble with Peace is coming out in September. How's that gearing up? Is it going pretty smoothly?
Well, hopefully so. I mean, obviously, the old COVID stuff is throwing a few wrenches into the book trade in general. I mean, obviously, people still want books, so it's an industry that's better fixed than many, I think. But still, bookshops are all shut, and those traditional means of promotion and marketing, going out there and doing bookshop events, festivals, conventions, all of that's completely gone. So publishers are kind of in a bit of a pickle, and certainly some big releases. I don't know about fantasy specifically, but big releases in the kind of thriller sphere and the general fiction, they're starting to get moved, starting to get pushed down the year. And so when things do open up again, it's going to be, maybe not that much oxygen in the book trade because there'll be so many big releases suddenly getting dropped. So, it's a little bit of a testing time, and anyone who's got a book coming out over the next couple of months is going to be a little concerned, I think. Hopefully by September things will start to have settled. But the traditional round of kind of cover copy and cover reveals and all those things have been slightly derailed because Amazon as well is having trouble managing the whole mass of stuff they're trying to sell and the huge increase in orders and all those things. So it's a difficult time for everyone, and that means hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll still hit September. I very much aim to, and we've been planning that for a long time, so it'd be quite gutting if things had to move. But there's always that possibility. But I hope it will be September. The book itself is completely finished. It just needs proofreading now. And then we'll be there. The covers in the UK and US are basically done. We're just doing the final touches to those. So hopefully we're ready, and hopefully it will appear mid-September as planned.
Okay. Are we about to see a bunch of authors really start pushing e-readers and say, like, this is the way to go? You can get my book on release.
Well, it's been kind of... coming for a long time, and certainly in the US and perhaps to a slightly lesser degree the UK, that ebook market and increasingly the audio market is a really big chunk of anyone's sales. I mean, perhaps especially in sci-fi and fantasy as well. And audio coming to be a bigger and bigger part of the market too. So, if ebook and audio is working on all cylinders, that's most of your, market satisfied. But it would still, the paper book is still a big part of it.
Oh yeah.
For anyone who's traditionally published, so to lose that, it would be a big concern. So everyone's sort of juggling their thoughts about this and wondering what the best way to go is. But certainly expect to see more online interviews, more online events, more kind of Facebook Live and things of that kind instead of the traditional bookstop events, because if you imagine the worst possible social distancing, it would probably be shaking the hands of a queue of several dozen people in a small, sweaty room.
Yeah.
While they handle an object which they pass to you and then possibly hug you for a photo. It's not ideal from, it's hard to imagine anyone doing that. 3 or 4 months ago, I was in Barcelona kind of with crowds of people and so on, and it's hard to imagine that happening now.
Yeah, we're definitely a good bit off from there. But go ahead and just shifting, if you don't mind, into the world of the First Law. So one thing I've noticed, I'm just getting through the standalones now. And one thing I've noticed, it seems you approach this world with a new angle with each story. Like this most recent one, Best Served Cold is what I just read. And it's a very clear revenge tale. It's something I hadn't seen in First Law before to that extent. Do you often come in like, this time I want to try and tell an Ocean's 11 type story? Or is it just whatever strikes your fancy? Are you always trying to craft a new story in that sense? How do you develop the plot of a new First Law book?
Well, certainly, you want to always strike that difficult balance between giving readers something of what they expect, something of what they want from you, but at the same time, you don't want to bore them with just the same stuff over and over. And every reader's preferences will be different in that regard, And in the end, you have to write what you want to write. But I'm not someone who necessarily overflows with ideas, as you can probably tell. I work on one book at a time, and I think of one idea at a time. I don't have trunks full of books waiting to be done. And really, when I finished the first Law Trilogy, which was the book I had in me to write my whole life, if you like. They say everyone has one story. That was kind of mine, my take on classic fantasy. So I suppose you could say it was someone else's story in many ways. My take on someone else's story. Having written that, I didn't want to then do more, classic wizards and dragons and magic swords type stuff necessarily. I wanted to try my hand at something slightly different. I think I was a little frustrated with the massive size of some of the series and books that were out there, which is not to say that I write small books or series, but I felt like I should be able to tell a good story in one big book, So I wanted to try something that stood alone a bit more, that was a bit tighter, a bit more focused. And so I kind of went to filmic plots, really. I've always been a big film fan and watch a lot of TV and film. And so I thought of, 3 of my favourite films. I had to come up with an idea to write 3 books. And I thought, 3 favourite films: Point Blank, the John Boorman thriller with Lee Marvin; Bridge Too Far, the big picture war film; and Unforgiven, and other westerns of a similar mould, Outlaw Josie Wells, things of that kind. So I thought, I'll do a gangster revenge type thriller, I'll do a war story, and I'll do a western, basically, but within this world, because I thought, you might as well pick up on all those characters and those settings you've worked to produce and save a bit of time on the research and preparation, And that's where those 3 books came from. Best Served Cold was my kind of weird take on a Lee Marvin thriller, but with Lee Marvin turned into a woman, as you do. And then The Heroes was the kind of war story told from both sides, the tale of a single battle in a single focused place. And then Red Country was the western. So that was really where those ideas came from. And then they came to, obviously, as any book does, include a whole raft of other weird and wonderful influences pulled from all kinds of different places, some of which I could never really tell you where they came from. But that was essentially the idea: shorter, tighter, focused plots with a different tone, and with a Little Hatred and the Age of Madness generally. Again, the idea was to provide something that gave the essence of what had worked with the first Law, as far as I could tell, but took it into a slightly different time period and a slightly different tone by kind of moving into a more industrial era.
Okay, yeah, that it vibes with what I've read, to say the least. Now, you yourself have said, in a recent interview I just watched with you, you described fantasy as a fuzzy genre. It's something that it's very broad, it's hard to pin down exactly, and you yourself are often talked about as a minimal fantasy author. You don't have grand epic displays of magic, in First Law hardly ever. And so I was wondering, do you think of yourself as a fantasy author first and foremost, or are you just kind of exploring through fantasy? How do you define yourself in that sense?
A lot of these questions are in a way not for oneself to answer, or, not most interestingly. I mean, writers are kind of best characterized by readers, and books often best characterized by, readers and critics and publishers in the way they publish them, I suppose. I do describe myself as a fantasy author. I think what I write is absolutely fantasy. I was, writing in that tradition of Lord of the Rings above all, but also other books that I'd read in that line, like, Michael Moorcock's Coram and Elric, and Ursula Le Guin's Wizard of Earthsea, Dragonlance, David Eddings. I read huge amounts of this stuff when I was a kid, and played a lot of role-playing games. And it was really all came out of that. So I certainly don't think of myself as some literary hero ready to set this genre to rights. I'm entirely writing from within fantasy and absolutely happy with that. And I absolutely believe that, you can do within fantasy books that are just as deep and meaningful and relevant as you can in any other form. So fantasy is very wide. You can have writers like China Mieville writing something strange and weird and literary and challenging and political, or you can have people who are writing much more pulpy, much more shiny, much more kind of accessible and commercial stuff, and that's all great. I think I would quote or probably misquote Mao when he said, "Let 100 flowers bloom and 1,000 schools of thought contend," shortly before purging his political enemies. But generally speaking, I think, the more variety, the better, and the healthier a genre becomes. There was probably a time, in the 80s, 90s, when fantasy did feel a little bit one note to me as a reader. I'm sure there was masses of other stuff out there, but before the internet and without any touch with fandom, really, that I had as a kid growing up, what I was reading was kind of the obvious pulpy commercial fantasy, and it felt like that had become quite safe, quite predictable, quite routine. And so I think fantasy was due for a bit of a reinvention when, Game of Thrones appeared and really changed my feelings about what you could do within commercial fantasy. But it's great that it's broad and wide, and it feels like it's getting more interesting and diverse with every year. There was a time when you could really, say what the big releases were in fantasy and sci-fi. When, say, the Hugo Awards just represented what was really out there. And now it's impossible for any one award to really get across the breadth and the range of all the stuff there is. And I think that's a great sign.
Yeah. I think the best way I've heard it described is genre in general is wibbly wobbly. It kind of just fits different things, and you can put wherever you would like. And I definitely like the comparison of it's impossible for awards to do it justice now, in my opinion. There's just too much coming out. No one person can read it all to fairly critique it all. And so I completely agree there. But you brought up a Game of Thrones, which I'm sure you're aware you are frequently in the same conversation of when it comes to...
I think it's going to be big. I think I know the writer George Martin a little bit, and I think he's got great things ahead of him. Mm-hmm. Young, exciting, thrusting guy, new on the scene. I think he could really make waves. One of these days.
Yeah, for maybe. We'll just see if the TV if it's doable. It might be too epic of a fantasy story.
Well, it's a big ask, isn't it? It's a big ask. We can hope.
But in that same vein, do you when you're compared to series like Game of Thrones? I mean, you got to take that as a bit of a compliment. But is there a bit of yeah, but I wish I could write Game of Thrones my way too? Do you also have a creative I would do that, but I do it this way kind of feeling?
Well, I mean, it's lovely to be compared to anyone who's successful, for sure.
Oh, yeah.
And, double lovely to be compared to someone who was, a big, big influence on you, as George was, and a Game of Thrones, especially that first book. Really, you can overuse the sort of phrase blew my mind and so on, but it really did change my feelings about fantasy. I'd read a lot of stuff. I'd got slightly jaded with it all. And when I was given that book by a friend, he said, "Oh, you used to read this kind of fantasy stuff, and you should read this. This is interesting." And I looked at the cover, which I probably have behind here somewhere. Yeah, there you go. Here's the very book. I looked at the cover and I thought, man, I know what happens in this, because there's the knight and the wizard and the pretty lady. I've seen all this before, man. And of course, I got the best kind of shock, and I really saw in Game of Thrones a lot of what I felt had been missing. Mm-hmm. The shock and the kind of grittiness and the darkness. Everyone talks about that, and it was quite mind blowing. I don't want to spoil anything, for anyone, but there's some major character deaths which are quite shocking, especially in that first book. And there's a sense fantasy will never be the same, but it was also the way it was written, the kind of tight point of view writing. Tolkien is the template for fantasy, and don't get me wrong, I love Tolkien, huge fan and so on, but he takes a certain approach, which is quite a dignified, distant narration, looking down on things. It's narration by Gandalf. It's narration by a dignified wizard. There's not a visceral sense of involvement. That's not what he's going for. And so it was a real kind of refreshing take to read Martin's writing, where he's very much in the heads of the people, and their emotions and their thoughts are there raw on the page, and that just felt suddenly exciting and fresh to me, and was really the encouragement to start writing myself, or a big factor in it.
It adds a level of humanity that just makes it more relatable. It feels like, at least to me, that grittiness to me, it makes it, this feels like actual people in the real world, which is sad in some ways to say, but it feels like things that could really happen on the earth level, to me at least.
Yeah, and they're these vivid and funny and dirty and kind of multi-layered characters, which is not something I was used to seeing. I'd got to when a character's first introduced, you can tell by the color of their armor pretty much which way the plot's going to go sometimes. And so it was exciting to see a book where you couldn't predict the people and where they felt like they really, leapt off the page in that way. I mean, I remember reading James Ellroy's LA Quartet, obviously not fantasy thrillers, LA Confidential being one of those books, sometime before. And that takes this very kind of person-centered approach. Every chapter's written from a given point of view, and the style of the writing and the whole feel of the way the book's written changes completely from the different points of view. And I thought, wow, this is so kind of exciting and involving. Why don't people write fantasy this way? And then when Game of Thrones appeared, that clearly was, at least partly that approach. So it was the right book at the right time for me, absolutely.
All right. Now, pulling a little bit away from the deep literature talk, I see them on the shelf behind you, and judging from your Twitter, it seems you're a rather large gaming fan as well. Is that fair to say? Oh,
yeah, that's fair. Absolutely fair to say. I've been playing games since I was tiny. Well, since they first appeared, really, I suppose. I'm about your age, I think. You're maybe a couple of years older than me. But yeah, since the late 70s, I have been playing video games.
Okay, and have they influenced your writing? Is there any specific games that you go, okay, this one was majorly impactful in how I view character development or lore, telling information, anything like that?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, certainly there. I think everything you sort of read and watch and play and experience in life, everything that makes up part of a writer's life finds its way into the books in one way or another. It's not just books that are the influences by any means. I mean, I'm very influenced by film and TV. I'm sad to say I don't read an awful lot these days, and most of what I do read is non-fiction. I find fiction quite difficult to read, quite disturbing in my process in a way, especially fantasy. But video games have been a part of my life for a long time, and I mean, certainly, war games, Total War. I'm a sucker for Shogun Total War and its many sequels, to the extent I can't really have a PC anymore. I have to only have a console, because otherwise I'll just get, you can lose 50 hours to The Last of Us, and it's a wonderful filmic experience, but I can lose hundreds of hours to Total War, and I can't really afford to do that these days.
I've probably lost thousands of hours to Total War.
Yeah,
Medieval sure Total War 2. Yeah, that was my teenage years.
Yeah, Medieval Total War I was playing in my kind of probably late 20s, early 30s, I guess. And so, other things like Baldur's Gate, those big role-playing games of that similar kind of era, Civilization, many other things, they've all sort of, had a definite impact on the way that I write and think, I would say. I mean, I don't know that there are games that from, of that formative era when I was reading things like Game of Thrones and earlier on Lord of the Rings, so when I was in my teens, when I was really soaking up the big influences, I don't think games were quite developed enough on the whole to provide grist for character in the way that other things do. But I think what is interesting is games of that era gave you so much less. They didn't give you beautifully rendered characters with great dialogue and amazing voice acting and careful plotting. They gave you a little few pixels blipping around, and in a way you had to fill in your own details. You had to make up your own backstory. I was a huge fan of Elite when it first came out, the freeform space trading game, which was just a mind-blowing quantum leap forward when it appeared. But I kind of made up my own stories around it, around the character I was playing and what was going on in the universe, because it wasn't there in the game. You kind of had to do that. And so I think that experience of creation, which happened, with role-playing games, the Dungeons and Dragons and things like that I was playing at the time as well, where you have to fill in the blanks yourself, that was certainly a very useful experience in my earliest kind of storytelling adventures, I guess.
That lines up pretty well. I mean, I've definitely seen gaming recently narratively step up, right? Like we don't have Last of Us back in the day, and it's because of probably the technical shortcomings you were saying, where they didn't have the resources. But in a complete left turn, once again, I'm getting through some fan questions. I asked the audience, what would they like me to ask you? Okay. And about a third of them were about First Law movies, and I'm sure you can't get into specifics, anything happening there. So in the most general sense, I know you can't say X, Y, Z, but is there any communication with the forces that be in Hollywood? And will Joaquin Phoenix be playing Galacta? Like, just no specifics, but can we get a promise there?
It's been very hard for me to pin Joaquin down. You know, he ducks my calls. He's never there when I turn up at the bar. It's very difficult, you know. Um, the problem with this is kind of twofold. Firstly, that you're often not able to say much,
Right.
legally speaking. But secondly, also, inevitably, if you say anything, that then causes people to get excited and to expect
Right,
stuff.
right.
And I've learned over time the best thing is probably just to say as little as possible.
Okay.
I mean, I think because, you know, Game of Thrones obviously has had this huge impact, you know, not just within fantasy circles, but within, you know, TV and media as a whole, culture as a whole, really. There is a huge interest in fantasy these days, and there's definitely a market there for that. And so anyone who's got a significant series has probably had a few calls, you know. And so I have been involved in stuff for some time. There's stuff going on, but generally speaking, I find it's better to say nothing.
Okay.
Therefore, I will remain silent on that question for now.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I will just say it's confirmed Joaquin Phoenix is involved, and likely by the end of the year we'll have something. That seems like
Absolutely.
a fair.
You bet. You bet. Joaquin's getting his armor on even as we speak.
Gotcha. Perfect. Well, thank you for at least giving what you could there. I appreciate it, because I know that is a bit of a tricky minefield to navigate.
I hope someday there'll be a thrillingly exciting announcement and we can sit down and discuss it in detail. Sadly, that day is not today.
I understand.
I mean, clearly that business is you know, completely hit the bumpers anyway right at the moment, and it's a very weird, much weirder time in Hollywood in the book trade. No one's shooting anything, and you know, as a result, a lot of projects are on ice, whereas others are moving forward because development can still go on. So it's you know, now is a very weird time anyway.
Yeah, if you're lucky enough to be in the place where you have post-production, people can work at home because they got super powerful PCs and they can, you know, get those VFX going. So that's, you know, some people are lucky enough to be there.
Yeah.
You did notably say in our messages back and forth that you are okay with me holding your feet to the fire. So I will
Bring on the fire.
I will kind of say, is there any characters or story ideas you've seen from one of your modern peers that you're thinking, damn, I wish I wrote that? Anything specifically where you just kind of look at some creative part of a book and go, that is something I wish I could tackle?
Oh, look, I mean, I think whenever you read anything, there are always things you admire and things you like, and perhaps things that you know you don't like or you would do differently. The joy of reading and writing is that every writer, and in a way every reader too, on the whole, you know, comes to a book with a different approach. You know, what makes me respond really well to a writer is often that really powerful voice. You know, that sense of a character's whole way of expressing themselves and talking and thinking that is something I would never think of. You know, so I don't think I'd ever read a book and think, I wish I'd done that, because I never would, if you know what I mean. I never could think of that. If it's something great, it's something I would never have thought of. And likewise, you know, I want my books to reflect me and my voice in a way, so I wouldn't think of it in those terms. I mean, I'm certainly hugely jealous of other people's success. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm as venomously ambitious as the next guy, if not a little bit more so. So, you know, I'm jealous of success. And, you know, look, like, I think Game of Thrones is a fantastic character that produced, but I don't think to myself, I wish I'd written Game of Thrones, because that feels like a strange thing to do. I'm kind of happy to be me, I guess, up to a point. I like the books I wrote. Yeah.
Okay, so there's no individual characters or magic systems where you're like, that is a cool little thing that allows for neat quirks, nothing specific?
I mean, there are many things of that kind. I mean, you know, like Wizard of Earthsea, I hugely love the kind of way she does magic in that book and how it feels like there's a system there, but at the same time it's a mysterious one, an unknowable one you can't really fully understand.
Yeah.
I just think that's a beautifully written book. You know, recently I was reading Rosemary Sutcliffe to one of my kids. She's a historical writer, British historical writer, mostly of young, kind of not even young adult, but kids' books really, I suppose. And she just has these fantastic turns of phrase when she's describing the natural world and the way the wind goes over the heather and the sea and the sunset. And sometimes you'll read these lines that have this kind of this alliteration in them and this rhythm, and just think, this is fantastic. Just, I have to read them over and over again. My kids get bored, they go away, they walk off while I'm thinking, this is such a brilliant line. And so, you know, there are always snatches of books that you find hugely exciting, but it's hard to pick one thing, certainly.
Okay, so that actually is a nice segue to another question I have here, because one of the things that sticks out to me most boldly for your books that I think people need to talk about more is your prose. I find there is just a great beauty to the way you approach writing lines all the way up to the titles. Like from top to bottom, there is an extreme care, it seems, to find beauty in very human dialogue, where it doesn't feel like this is something a grand epic fantasy character is saying. It feels human, but it's just, I'm going to be thinking about that for the next month. How in the world did you develop your prose style? I know that's a very broad, big question, but I need some form of answer here, because it's something I'm obsessed with.
Oh, well, thank you very much in the first place. I mean, I think, you know, when people talk about prose, I often don't totally understand the way they think about it, or I think it's a slightly odd kind of discussion ensues about. Often it's about how something's poetic, or it's smooth, or it's flowing, as though the aim of prose is to be slick, you know, and I don't always think that's the case. I think for me, you know, good writing is writing that reflects what you're writing about, reflects the thought process of the person you're writing from, and the events that are taking place and the way they're feeling, and gets across the emotion of the scene. And so really, the way I approach it has always been to try and get into the head of the character. That's the very first and the foundational thing, really, right from the start, even before I really knew that was what I was doing, if you like. And, you know, to make writing from the different points of view feel distinct and different, not only in the way they think or the way they talk, but in the whole essence of the writing, the length of the sentences, the word choice, the rhythm, you know. Pharaoh, for instance, is colorblind, so she never talks about color in any of the descriptions. They're always black and white. And I try all kinds of tricks and things of that kind, but in the end, you kind of just write a first draft, or these days I write a first draft that's relatively neutral. And over time, as the characters develop, I start to get a better and better sense of what they're like, until putting those boots on, if you like, of a given character becomes sort of instinctive, and the prose style comes to reflect the way they think and the way they are. And the other thing that I try and keep in mind, or one other thing, is honesty, which was some advice my mum gave me. All the best advice comes from mother, doesn't it, in the end? And my mother was an English teacher. She's very well and very widely read and very astute on writing and the details of how writing's put together. You know, from very early on, when I was a kid, she was reading me things, she would do what I do with my kids and stop and say, wow, isn't that line amazing, because it does this, because there's a mirror between the front and the end, because it has that rhythm, or it has that alliteration, or the nature of the words reflects the feeling of the sentence, you know. All those things she tried to get me wise to and to understand. And she, when I first showed her some of my writing, which took some time to pluck up the courage, they say never show writing to your family because they'll be too positive, and that's not a problem that I have in my family. They're willing to be pretty critical. And so when she first, you know, was reading my stuff, and she was very positive about it and very encouraging, hugely encouraging. It was one of the big things that kind of got me taking it seriously. She read some line I'd written, which was, I can't even remember what it was, but the stars were scattered like diamonds on a sable cloth, or some crap like that, you know. And she said, are they though? You know, is that what stars look like? Is that true? And she said, you've always got to be truthful when you describe something, when you use an image, when you write a line of dialogue. You know, you always try and say to yourself, is this actually true, or is it a kind of cliche, an obvious thing that you're reaching for just to fill the space? You know, you ask yourself, is that real? Does it make sense? Is it concrete and believable? And so if you're always asking yourself that question with every with every metaphor and with every kind of bit of description, is that what the thing looks like? And if you feel like it's not, then you take it apart and you add something that does feel truthful. If you're always asking yourself that question, I think very, very cliched and boring plots can become fascinating. In a way, the plots and the content is, to me, not that important. It's the way that it's done and the voice in which it's told can make it fascinating again. So trying to stay truthful is also key. Of course, you won't always succeed, but you try and hold yourself to an impossible standard, then maybe you'll at least reach an above average one. That's the hope.
Wow, that was I'm gonna go delete everything I wrote. Anyway,
it's always a good start.
Yeah, so it seems like with that approach, though, there's a lot of rewriting, I assume, in your process. Because you said as you're getting more comfortable in these boots, I imagine you have to go back and rewrite some things now that you're comfortable in these boots of the character.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, rewriting's always been, the heart of the way that I write. Not to say my first drafts aren't spectacular. And they have got better over time. But for me, that feeling of kind of, what you want in the reader is this feeling of being completely relaxed. Like, they're not bumping over some bit of dialogue or some clunky construction or something that doesn't feel quite true, that's making them think, oh, is that right? Is that wrong? You want them to feel completely safe and that the writer's totally under control. You want them to feel like they're in safe hands, I suppose, would be the thing. Remind me of the question again? I've run out of road.
You're good. I was basically asking the comfort level, having to go back. Which characters do you feel like? I mean, kind of expounding further on, you have characters that it's got to be very difficult to be comfortable in their boots. Like, the obvious Glocta. It's got to be rather difficult to sit in that man's head for weeks while you're writing his character. Do you actually really try to put yourself in that mindset, or are you more of a from the outside writer, just pinning the character as it comes to you?
Oh yeah, I mean, you totally try and put yourself in the mindset, I think. Absolutely. If it's the point of view character, then you want everything to feel like it's from their point of view. Mm-hmm. But the revision is a kind of huge part of that. When I started writing, I'd write a paragraph and then I'd go over the paragraph and I'd rewrite completely. And then when I got to the end of a page, I'd go over the whole page and rewrite it completely. When I started a session of writing, I'd start by going over what I did the day before. And maybe that kind of came from being an editor as a TV editor, which was the work I was doing at that time, where you're constantly taking a set of notes and adjusting what you do in relation to those notes, then going over and changing and tweaking and constantly improving and refining, But that always seemed the natural approach to me. And so the Blade itself, those early chapters, I went over and over and over again and again and again. And what would happen is that, say, with Logan's voice, you'd start to use these phrases and that would feel, that phrase just suits him, that phrase just works as, an indicator of his character. And so you'd come back to that phrase and keep using it, and the characters would develop these kind of motifs that are, throughout the writing in a way. And so I was endlessly refining and endlessly trying to cut. And of course, I look at that book now and I'd cut a whole lot more and I'd do things very, very differently. But still, I was learning the kind of nuts and bolts of how you go about structuring a scene and where to use dialogue, where to use thought, what you can lose, how you get from A to B as efficiently as possible. And so, revision and cutting has always been a big part. And these days I'm a bit more structured in the way that I do it. So I'll write a first draft quite quickly, especially with these recent books, because the idea was to write a first draft of the whole trilogy in one big go, and then to go back and revise the whole thing en masse. And so a lot of revision, I'll write a first draft and then I'll go back and write a second draft where I'm really getting the front of the book to match the end, because my ideas about what the characters are and what needs to happen will have developed quite a lot over the course of the writing. Mm-hmm. So I write part by part, and at the end of a part I send it to my editor and we discuss it, and that gives me a better idea of where to go with the next part, and then I write the next part, and by the time you get to the end of a book, hopefully then you know exactly what you're doing. This is the hope. This is the dream. Usually does happen. There'll still be questions, but certainly you know a lot better than at the start. So then you go back to the start and you change a lot of things, you rewrite. You've probably got some ideas about the plot now, things that need to be seeded more early on, some characters who've become unimportant, you can maybe cut altogether or combine into a single character. Some characters who've changed, who you feel, well, maybe they need to be a bit more unpleasant for that shock to work, or they need to be a bit more generous and nice seeming for the shock to work. So you make a few changes as you go, and then you apply those throughout, and that gives you a second draft. And then your editor will do edits, and then I have a round where I look just at character, and I'm working on the voices of the central characters, but also of the secondaries, to kind of get anything neutral, like she raised her brows, to try and change that to something that's more reflective of the personality of that individual character, refining the dialogue and trying to get the voices as good as I can. And then I'll do a pass for setting, where I'm kind of looking at, the same thing with what's going on around, trying to make everything as distinctive and, to put as much character and personality into the setting as possible, because, you can have a neutral conversation that takes place nowhere. You don't have to describe the room at all, and that's probably what I start with. But then you can start thinking about the room, or is it outside? What's the weather? What's the time of year? What's the time of day? What difference does that make to how things look? What difference does that make to how the characters feel? If it's cold, does it remind them of another day it was cold? Is there a mounted bull's head on the wall which has them thinking in a certain direction? All these things. You maybe try and pick out a feature or two. It doesn't have to be a lot, but just something to lend personality to every setting. Sometimes that's implicit in what you've done already, but sometimes it helps to add some of that in. So you do the pass for setting, then you probably have a line edit where your editor's looking at the detail of each line and making specific recommendations. Then I do a kind of prose pass, which is where I just go through looking for anything that I think I could say better word choices, better images, maybe sometimes a nasty paragraph here or there I might try and rewrite and rethink a little bit to give a bit more theme and shape to it. And then the book's kind of done, but there's a copy edit and a proofread still to do, and then there you go, it's done. Then start again. So that's kind of the revision process as it happens now. Yeah.
So I naturally need to ask about, maybe the most discussed feature of your writing at this point, though, is the character work. I mean, your character. How do you go about developing one of the incredibly diverse cast of characters that you have for a book? Because you'll have a strong female protagonist leading it with someone with disabilities behind her. And, there just seems to be this always very interesting selection of characters to make up the, cast here. How do you go about figuring out what you're going to pull from to assemble, this crew together?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think, character is one of those things. I'm sort of, I'm quite a workman-like writer, I think. I try always to think of writing as work and not to think of it as some magical, mystical process which you, a mortal, could never understand in its depth and detail. I try to ignore the muse, to just think of it as chair time, break everything down into small technical steps. To me, the magic arises out of craftsmanship, if you like. But having said that, character seems to be the one area where you're never quite sure what the magic is. And some characters work brilliantly well straight away, Some characters burst onto the page and are just there. Like Koska, for example, was a secondary character who just appeared, and straight away he had this tone of voice and a way of talking, a way of holding himself, which is sort of bizarre when you talk about someone you're inventing on the page, that just was compelling and fascinating, and he was there right away. Others take much more time, and indeed, you can apply huge effort and energy and thought to trying to bring personality to a character and get them the way you want them, and they still never quite catch fire in the way that some of these characters do just right off. I mean, also when I wrote the first Law, those characters had been in mind for years and years for me, and so they were kind of, without knowing it, they were somewhat instinctive. I already knew a lot of how to write those people, and so when I started writing those books, they spilled out, not effortlessly, but with less effort than I would need later, and often with diminishing returns, I think, sometimes. So these days, I mean, at the design stage of a book, I suppose I'm thinking about who I need, who the book's about. So Best Served Cold. Best Served Cold was my take on on a Lee Marvin film, a gangster revenge thriller, and so it's about a central character who wants revenge on an employer who's betrayed them, with a few twists in the tale and a few henchmen to get through along the way. And so I kind of knew I needed that central person. I was interested in Renaissance Italy and in condottieri, the mercenaries of Renaissance Italy. So I thought I'll do a character who's a mercenary as a central role. And since I'd worked with a lot of male characters in First Law, it felt like the right time to do a female central character and a good kind of twist and reversal on that trope, if you like. So a female mercenary as the central character. And then I felt like she needed a kind of gang around her to help her with this task, and the villain needed a kind of gang around him that would be opposed. And so that was really the demands of the plot, I suppose, set up for the roles that I needed to fill. And then I suppose I just started to think, who's left on the shelf? What characters have I got that I used in the First Law that would make sense fitting into this story? And what characters do I need? Who would it make sense to have? You need a thief, you need a poisoner. If you're trying to kill a lot of people, you need some muscle. You need an autistic thug, perhaps. I don't know. So I just started to think of these characters that I'd like to do. And then you start to develop them. And quite early on, you start to write. I mean, these days especially, I try not to spend too much time planning. Certainly a bit, but I'll try and do a few introductory chapters just so I can kind of get a feel for how it's going to be, how it's going to feel, what the characters are like. And then you'll probably quite quickly get an idea of what they need to be like. And in fact, what works on the page then trumps your planning generally. If you think to yourself, actually, wouldn't it be better if this character was a man? Wouldn't that work better with the people around them? Or wouldn't it work better if the domineering parent is a mother rather than a father, or a father rather than a mother? Those kind of things. It's what works for the story rather than what you plan. So my plan's always an outline, a guideline, and then you develop and change and shift as you go.
Interesting. So you hit on there like how you're jumping, you jumped to Renaissance Italy to pull from inspiration there. Are we eventually going to see First Law continue to progress through time? Could we see Cyborg Galacta leading a Starship Federation at some point in the far distant future, or is there limits? Never going to push into the sci-fi.
Never say never. I mean, as I say, I tend to plan a book. I don't think much more than a few books ahead. So there's a reluctance to get to the modern day, and there's often, it feels as though handheld firearms are the tipping point somehow. Once you've got guns, it changes the dynamics quite markedly. But I'm sort of quite interested, having done magic fading as we move towards a more modern technology and into an industrial revolution. I'm vaguely interested in magic coming back into a more modern setting that feels like it's moved ahead of magic, if you like. So who knows? Who knows what the future holds?
So there's not some grand
you'll be
scheming...
and you should pre-order it now.
Gotcha. And it'll have a phenomenal title.
God, it's a super title. I mean, I don't know what it's going to be, but it's definitely be great.
Well, I appreciate you answering these questions from fans, from myself. It's so much fun to get through them with you here. Before I let you go, I have a small tier list ranked out from love, like, to horrible of just some fantasy races that I think it'd be interesting to see your reaction to as an author. And all I want to see is your gut instinct. Do you love this, fictional race? Would you totally put it in your work one day, or no? No interest in them. So I'm going to go ahead and share a screen with you, if you don't mind.
Well, I will just presage it by saying, I think any element is great when it's done well and terrible when it's done badly. So it may be hard for me to give you more of an instinct than that, but I will try. All
right. So I pulled some ones that I thought might be outside the box enough. Do you see, are we screen sharing right now, or is that not?
Yeah,
okay.
With that, I'm getting it.
All right. So we have, starting from left to right, we have Ints, Ghosts, Cthulhu, Elves, a Kraken, Dragons, and Orcs. And we have the ranking to I love it, I like it, and horrible, toss it in the trash. So starting out with Ints, where do you feel they sit in the mantle of fantasy?
I'm pretty on Ints.
Okay. All right.
Pretty
I want to let you know, 1,000 Tolkien fans just started typing.
Look, I mean, I love Tolkien, and I wouldn't say the Ents are the strongest part of his oeuvre.
Yeah. So then we have the broad spectrum classic ghosts, the ones that have been there since back in the day.
Spectrum.
Yeah.
So many types of ghosts, I would go with like on the ghost, I guess.
Okay. Kind of just averaging out all the different types. You say you just kind of like them. They're fun.
Yeah, I mean, there are ones that I love and ones that I'm not so keen on, but generally speaking, yeah.
Okay, so now getting hyper specific, right? Like I have Lovecraftian creation, Cthulhu. Any strong opinions?
What do you think of ghosts as a whole category? What do you think of Cthulhu specifically? I kind of like, I suppose, I played Call of Cthulhu when I was a kid, and I do like just the bizarreness and the intense horror and pessimism of his mold. So let's put him in like.
Okay, got a good liking there for Cthulhu. Elves, something you've worked with before, you're familiar with. How do you feel about the race of elves?
The thing is, you could do really exciting elves, or you could do really dull elves. I mean, I'll put them in the category, I suppose.
Interesting. All right.
Be my first choice.
Now, from Sailor's Myths, we have the Kraken, something that I pulled from because of my own personal affinity for. I love the idea of sea monsters. How do you feel with that?
I like I like what lies below the unknown depths from which they rise.
And then the most iconic, debatably, fantasy creature of all time, dragons.
Yeah, I mean, I like dragons. I wouldn't say love, because, you can do them so badly, and anything that is very overdone, it's easy to do badly. Therefore, I will say like for the dragon.
And finally, the most iconic cannon fodder of all of fantasy, the orc.
You see, I think orcs are misunderstood and due for a sympathetic hearing. I'm going to put the orcs in love. I'm going to do that.
Wow, okay. I'm going to say, of all the things I called happening here, not seeing orcs in love, but I love it. I love the left turn.
I think I got to love the orc. Learn to love your inner orc, that's what I'm saying. They're the true heroes of Lord of the Rings,
Oh, wow, okay. Well, there's a whole video that could be made on that idea alone, which I'd love to see.
No doubt, Gandalf is the villain. I'm telling you. I called it first.
Oh, well, thank you so much for coming on today, Joe. It's been fascinating to talk to you about your process, the development of First Law, and what you think of fantasy. So I immensely appreciate it, and be sure to check out The Trouble with Peace coming out this September, correct?
Absolutely so. And I think the mass market of A Little Hatred is out any day now, I think, in the UK anyway. Yeah, that's the next thing. But then Trouble with Peace in September, yes. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And where can people find you? On Twitter, Instagram? Do you have all the social medias?
I have some of the medias. I have a website at www.joeabercrombie.com. I'm on Twitter as Lord Grimdark. I was young. I made a mistake. And I think I'm on Facebook as well, though I'm not massively active there. It tends to be Twitter where I'm most generally daily active.
All right, that sounds good. I have so much fun watching you and Brent go at it, so I'll definitely encourage people to check you out on Twitter. He's a great writer too. I'll be sure to have your links right down there. And thank you so much for coming on.
It's a pleasure. Cheers.